5 people were buried inside a cave above the Nevada desert. Their bones sat there for nearly 2,000 years. And in that time, the world above them built an entire legend around their remains. Giants, cannibals, a lost race of red-haired monsters that science could never explain. For over 100 years, millions of people believed it. Then in 2025, scientists finally did what no one had dared to do before. They read the actual DNA, and everything collapsed. This is the full story of Lovelock Cave, the myth, the manipulation, and the moment the genetic code finally spoke. Stay with me, because what the science revealed is stranger and more powerful than the legend ever was. Let us go back to the very beginning. Long before Nevada was Nevada, long before any miners or archaeologists or newspaper reporters ever set foot in that desert, there was a story. It belonged to the Northern Paiute people, a nation whose ancestors had lived in that harsh, dry basin country for thousands of years. Their oral tradition carried a memory of war, a long, bitter, and violent conflict against a fierce enemy people they called the Si-Te-Cah. In the oldest tellings, these enemies were described as aggressive and strange. They had reddish hair. They were cannibals. They were feared. And in the end, after generations of conflict, the Pyute and their allied tribes drove the last of them into a cave near a dry lake bed. They piled brush at the entrance. They set it on fire. And they burned their enemies alive. That story was real. It belonged to a living people and had been carried carefully across countless generations. It was their history, their memory, their oral record of a war their ancestors survived. Nobody took that away from them. But what happened next is where things started to go badly wrong. In the 1880s, a mining engineer named John Reid heard the Pyute legend and asked to be taken to the cave. The Pyute led him there. He climbed in, expecting an ancient battlefield. What he found instead was bats, thousands of them. And underneath the bats, a floor buried under many feet of their accumulated dung. He left without finding any giants, without finding any battlefield, without finding anything that matched the dramatic story he had been told. But that bat dung turned out to be extremely valuable as fertilizer, and so the first real excavation of Lovelock Cave was not done by trained scientists. It was done by guano miners. Starting in 1911, 2 men named David Pugh and James Hart began shoveling tons of it out of the cave to sell, and as they dug, things started coming out of the earth. Baskets, sandals, nets and cordage, textiles woven with skill and care, and most remarkable of all, a collection of duck decoys made from tool reeds, carefully shaped and painted to lure waterfowl. These decoys would later be radiocarbon dated to roughly 2,000 years old, making them among the oldest known examples of their kind found anywhere in the world. Not in a museum in Europe, not in Egypt or China, right there in Nevada. And alongside all of that craft and beauty, there were human remains, bones, and in some cases preserved hair, hair that looked reddish. The miners wrecked a great deal of what they found. They were digging for fertilizer, not history. By the time archaeologists from the University of California arrived to do formal excavations in 1912 and again in 1924, much of the site was already disturbed. Still, researchers recovered around 10,000 artifacts. 10,000, a stunning record of human life layered in the dust across dozens of centuries. The baskets, the sandals, the nets, the duck decoys all spoke clearly of a people who had mastered this desert environment. Skilled hunters who worked the marshes of an ancient lake. People who had not merely survived in one of the hardest landscapes in North America, but had genuinely thrived there. That was the real story sitting right there in the cave. Ordinary, brilliant, deeply rooted human beings who had called this place home for millennia. The tools were not the tools of monsters. They were the tools of experts. But then someone noticed the hair, and the myth machine turned on. Here is what the excavators actually recorded. One mummy, a man described as roughly 6.5 feet tall, had distinctly reddish hair. That was it. One tall man. One set of reddish remains. The official 1929 excavation report published by the University of California made no mention of a race of giants. The archaeologists described people of ordinary size. They expressed doubt in print about whether the Pyute oral tradition even described a real war, or whether it was a Pyute explanation for the older human remains they kept finding in the desert ground. The scientists who actually did the work were careful and restrained. But careful and restrained does not sell newspapers. In the 1930s, local papers started running stories, not stories based on the scientific reports, stories based on rumor, exaggeration, and the hunger for sensation. Newspapers claimed skeletons of 7, 8, even nearly 10 feet had been pulled from the Nevada desert. One account described a giant body wrapped in a gum-covered fabric like an Egyptian mummy. The numbers grew with every retelling. The hair got redder, the bodies got taller, and then storytellers and showmen got involved. There were people in that era who understood something very simple. A giant sells tickets. A normal ancient human being does not. So they took the Pyute legend of the Si-Te-Cah, welded it to the newspaper giants, wrapped the whole thing in mystery and horror and the thrill of the forbidden, and sold it to the public as a proven archaeological discovery. A lost race of red-haired giants, cannibals from a vanished world, physically different from every other human being on the continent, and right there in the ground as proof. The story had everything a myth needs. It had bones you could point to. It had an old native legend that seemed to match. It had dramatic newspaper headlines. And it had showmen actively building exhibits and roadside displays around it because they needed the money and the crowds. Decade after decade, the story spread. It moved from newspapers into books. It moved from books into documentaries. It moved from documentaries onto the internet, where it found an enormous new audience of people who had never heard of Lovelock Cave, but were fascinated by ancient mysteries and evidence that mainstream science might be hiding something. By the time the 21st century arrived, millions of people around the world had encountered some version of the red-haired giants of Lovelock Cave. The story had taken on a life completely independent of any actual evidence. But underneath the headlines, there were problems, serious ones, problems the storytellers never mentioned. The first problem was the giants themselves. When you go back to the actual excavation reports, written by the trained archaeologists who did the real work, the giants simply are not there. No carefully measured 7-foot skeletons, no anatomically strange race of oversized humans. The one man described as notably tall was 6 feet 6 inches. Impressive for an ancient Great Basin population, but a completely normal human being by any biological standard. The reliable science recorded people of ordinary size, living ordinary Great Basin lives. The 10-foot giants existed only in newspaper articles that no one could trace back to a verified measurement. And here is something even more telling. Some of the most dramatic claims about giant skeletons can be followed back directly to people who were running tourist attractions at the time. Museum operators and roadside exhibit owners who had a direct financial interest in making the story as sensational as possible. Each retelling stretched the bones a little taller. Each new version made the hair a little redder. This is how myths grow. Not through lies exactly, but through incentive. Through the steady pressure of what people want to hear versus what actually happened. The second problem was the hair. That famous red hair has a far quieter explanation, one that any forensic scientist or archaeologist who works with ancient remains already knows well. Hair color is not stable after death. Over centuries and millennia in the ground, dark hair can slowly shift color. The dark pigment that makes hair black or brown, called eumelanin, breaks down faster than the reddish component of hair pigment during decomposition and burial. The chemistry of soil minerals and temperature and alkalinity all accelerate the process. The result is that ancient people with naturally dark black or dark brown hair can end up with hair that looks unmistakably rusty red or orange when their remains are finally unearthed thousands of years later. This is not a theory invented to dismiss the Lovelock Giants. It is a documented, well-understood taphonomic process that shows up on mummified remains in Egypt, in Peru, in Europe, all over the world. Historian Adrienne Mayer laid this out in detail in her 2005 book, examining how fossil remains and ancient bones generate mythological traditions. The red-haired giants may simply have been dark-haired people whose hair had changed color in the ground. There was never any genetic or pigment analysis of the Lovelock hair that confirmed natural red hair. The color alone was taken as proof, and that was never enough. So for 100 years, ordinary human remains were dressed up in monster clothing. The bones of real people, people with families and knowledge and extraordinary craft skills, were turned into showroom freaks and newspaper sensations. Their descendants were watching all of it happen from the outside, having no say in how their own ancestors were being described and displayed. And then science finally asked the right question. Not what do these bones look like, but what do these bones say? In April 2025, a team of researchers published a genetic analysis of ancient DNA extracted from 5 individuals buried in Lovelock Cave. This was not the first time DNA had been pulled from the region. A major 2018 study published in the journal Science had already analyzed the Lovelock skeletons as part of a sweeping examination of ancient remains across North and South America, confirming they carried Native American genetic lineages consistent with the deep ancestral populations of the Great Basin. But the 2025 study went further and did something that 2018 work had also done carefully. It was conducted with the full knowledge, permission, and cooperation of the Lovelock Pyute tribe. That matters more than it might seem. For a century, this story had been told about the Pyute people over their heads and without their consent. Outsiders had taken their oral tradition, their ancestors' bones, and their ancestral homeland and built a carnival around it. This time was different. The descendants of the people in the cave were partners in the science. Not bystanders, not objects. Partners. The research was not done to them. It was done with them. And the results came back clear and quiet and final. The first finding was the most fundamental. These were not a foreign race. Their genetic signatures place them firmly among the ancient indigenous peoples of the Great Basin region, deep-rooted, long-established inhabitants of that exact landscape, not travelers from a distant island, not an anomalous population dropped in from somewhere else. People of this land, genetically speaking, in every way that can be measured. The second finding went even deeper. The DNA showed genetic continuity reaching back 10,000 years. A 2025 analysis connecting the Lovelock Cave individuals with the Spirit Cave mummy, whose remains dated back over 10,000 years and had already been confirmed through earlier studies as a direct ancestor of modern Pyute people, established an unbroken genetic thread running from the Ice Age all the way to living people today. The Northern Paiute and Fallon Paiute Shoshone people who had been saying all along that these were their ancestors were right. The science confirmed what their oral traditions had been carrying for thousands of years. The third finding is the one that cuts right through the heart of the myth. There was no separate race, there were no anomalous physical traits, no evidence of a distinct giant lineage, no genetic signature pointing to a different people. The 5 individuals in the cave were, genetically, exactly who you would expect to find buried in that landscape at that time. Normal, ancient Great Basin humans, ancestors, or close kin of the ancestors of the very people who gave permission for the study. The bones that showmen sold as monsters belonged to a real, ordinary, deeply rooted people whose descendants were standing right there, participating in the research that would finally clear their ancestors' names. So what do we do with all of this now? First, we have to separate 2 things that got tangled together and kept tangled for 100 years. On one side is the Pyute oral tradition, an ancient story that belongs to a living people and deserves to be treated with respect as their own history. The Pyute carried memories of war, of difficult enemies, of a hard-won victory. That memory is theirs. The DNA does not erase it. Ancient people did fight other ancient people. Conflict was real. The oral tradition likely preserves something true about the past, even if the details shifted across thousands of years of retelling. On the other side is the myth of the red-haired giants, a modern commercial invention built on top of the Pyute story by people who wanted a spectacle and were willing to distort both the archaeology and the native tradition to get it. Giant skeletons, 10-foot-tall cannibals, a lost master race that somehow vanished. None of that came from careful science. All of it came from newspaper editors, chasing headlines and showmen chasing ticket sales. The DNA does not mock the Pyute story. It simply strips away the monster and hands back the truth. Ordinary people, native to their land, remembered now not as a legend, but as themselves. And there is a much larger pattern here that is worth sitting with because Lovelock is not unique. This exact same thing has happened all over the world. Ancient bones found, a dramatic alternate explanation invented, claims that the real locals could never have built this, never have achieved that, never have been the sophisticated civilization the evidence shows they were. There must have been someone else, a lost white race, giants, visitors from another continent. The implication running through all of it, often unstated but always present, is that the people who were actually there could not have done it themselves. Someone greater must have been responsible. And again, when the genetic code finally speaks, it says the same thing. The people who were always there were the ones who built it all. The duck decoys 2,000 years old found in Lovelock Cave were not made by giants. They were made by the ancestors of the Pyute. The sandals, the baskets, the nets, the textiles, all of it, the work of real human beings who mastered one of the hardest environments on Earth without any help from a lost master race. That is not a smaller story than giants in a cave. That is a bigger story, because it is true. There is one more detail from the Lovelock science that almost nobody talks about. In 2022, a genetic researcher at Family Tree DNA discovered something remarkable. A living man in Oregon named Segura was found to share a very specific Y chromosome lineage with one of the ancient Lovelock individuals, designated Lovelock 4, who had been buried in the cave around 200 AD. The 2 of them, separated by nearly 2,000 years, shared a genetic branch that had split from all other known lineages more than 15,000 years ago. A living man today carrying the genetic signature of someone buried in that Nevada cave almost 2 millennia back. The people of Lovelock Cave did not vanish. Their descendants are here. They have always been here. The giants were never real, but the people were. And the people are extraordinary. Expert hunters who designed decoys so convincing they fooled ducks and modern engineers alike. Weavers who produced textiles fine enough to survive 2,000 years in the desert. Communities who navigated the brutal environment of the ancient Great Basin and passed their knowledge forward across hundreds of generations until it lives today in the DNA of people who are still there, still on that land, still carrying that inheritance. That is what Lovelock Cave actually contains. Not a mystery, not a monster. A record of an unbroken human line stretching back further than most civilizations on Earth. Proven now not just by the artifacts in the ground, but by the genetic code that cannot be faked, cannot be exaggerated, and does not care about what sells tickets. 100 years of giants that were never there. And underneath all of it, real people waiting for the code to clear their names. It did.